أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. لا أقسم بيوم القيامة ولا أقسم بالنفس اللوامة. أيحسب الإنسان أن لن نجمع عظامه بلى قادرين على أن نسوي بنانه بل يريد الإنسان ليفجر أمامه يسأل أيان يوم القيامة فإذا برق البصر وخسف القمر وجمع الشمس والقمر يقول الإنسان يومئذ أين المفر كلا لا وزر إلى ربك يومئذ المستقر ينبأ الإنسان يومئذ بما قدم وأخر بل الإنسان على نفسه بصيرة ولو ألقى معاذيره لا تحرك به لسانك لتعجل به إن علينا جمعه وقرآنه فإذا قرأناه فاتبع قرآنه ثم إن علينا بيانه كلا بل تحبون العاجلة وتذرون الآخرة وجوه يومئذ ناظرة إلى ربها ناظرة ووجوه يومئذ باسرة تظن أن يفعل بها فاقرة كلا إذا بلغت التراقي وقيل من راق وظن أنه الفراق والتفت الساق بالساق إلى ربك يومئذ المساق فلا صدق ولا صلى ولكن كذب وتولى ثم ذهب إلى أهله يتمطى أولى لك فأولى ثم أولى لك فأولى أيحسب الإنسان أن يترك سدى ألم يك نطفة من مني يمنى ثم كان علقة فخلق فسوى فجعل منه الزوجين الذكر والأنثى أليس ذلك بقادر على أن يحيي الموتى صدق الله العلي العظيم.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Today we are privileged to have with us Dr. Amina Inloes, who is an author, translator, and academic. In addition to lecturing in Islamic studies at the undergraduate and graduate levels, she is also a popular Islamic lecturer and is involved in public and community work. She has a doctorate in Islamic studies from the University of Exeter and has also attended the traditional seminary. Her research interests include Hadith, Islam and gender, and esoteric theology. For today's presentation on Islam and evolution, please welcome her with a salawat.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين ثم الصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين. So I've been told on some calendars today is Eid al-Ghadir, which is great because some of us can celebrate it on multiple days, and I hear some of us even get Eid al-Ghadir. So inshallah, we'll be getting it on multiple days. So in honor of that, I thought I might start with a few words narrated from Imam Rida, peace be upon him. Inna yawm al-Ghadir fi as-sama'i ashharu minhu fi al-ard. Of course, you all know what that means because you hear it all the time. But nonetheless, Eid al-Ghadir in the heavens is more, I would say, more famous, more known, more celebrated than upon the earth. So that's a nice way to start out because I was thinking it's Eid al-Ghadir and evolution. You know, evolution's very atheist sounding and very material sounding. Imam Ali is very, spiritual and Rabbani sounding. But of course, there is a link because, within the Shi'i tradition and many of the Sufi traditions, it's said that the first thing that Allah created was the light of the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and then Allah created the light of Amir al-Mu'mineen, alayhi salam. So we are talking about the beginning of creation, prior to all this evolution stuff. And similarly, when we look at the question of evolution, human evolution and Islam or anything else, we're also looking back at our origins, or more or less at our origins, as we will get into. So obviously, we're just going to scratch the surface of this subject today. I do see there's a number of people who are in a younger age bracket, in the age of taking school exams and so forth, so they might be able to correct me on some things because they all learn about this stuff in school, right? And they're oftentimes very good listeners. But very briefly, let's just kind of define the topic a bit, because that's a really loaded word, evolution. As you can see, not there. You can't even read that stuff back there. It's a loaded word because it's not only a scientific issue, but it's an ideological issue. And when ideas about evolution entered the Muslim world, it was during the colonialist era, the era of European high imperialism. That's what we call it now. That's the polite word for, conquering and taking resources and so forth. And so there was definitely a political and ideological context with which the Muslim world encountered this idea, which in part has shaped and continues to shape our responses, although in general, I think it's a more accepted idea. So for that reason, it's good to kind of define what we're talking about. Today, I'm just going to be talking about the possibility that the origin of life, like biological life, was from non-organic stuff, and something biologically happened that you guys learn about in school to make life, and the possibility that this evolved through natural mechanisms into plant life, animal life, and human life. So I'm not necessarily attaching that to atheism. Just giving that scenario is not giving an opinion about whether Allah exists, or whether this is Allah's plan, or it's a clockwork universe, or Allah is involved in the universe, or is it chance, etc. These are all theological and metaphysical issues that aren't actually related to what you're supposed to be discussing these days in science, even though, of course, there is a relationship. But I'm just putting that out there because many people do associate evolution with atheism and so forth. But of course, by the same token, in our time period, there is some scope for theistic evolution as well, seeing it as something which is harmonious with theistic beliefs, including monotheism. So let's talk a bit. So that's basically what I'm bounding the discussion as, and also the possibility or likelihood that there were other human species before us, and the question of who was Adam and so forth. So what I want to do, inshallah, is talk a little bit just more about the ideological picture, because I think you can't really distance the subject from that. And then I'm going to go specifically into some 12er Shi'i scholars' views. Now, if you're interested in other views, like maybe you're not a 12er Shi'i, I'll be happy to engage with those views too. But I'm just going to put these out there because even among 12er Shi'is, I think there doesn't tend to be a lot of awareness about where the discussion is at presently. Because when we talk about Adam and Eve, for example, regardless of whether we accept evolution or creationism or something else, we get a certain, one can say, traditional picture in mind, which is not as much the dominant view as we're getting in tafsir and scholarship today. So that's what we're going to do, inshallah. And if we have time for discussion and debate and everything, we can do that as well. I have views and opinions. I'm not going to impose my views and opinions as the only ones, because quite frankly, this is something we don't have certainty about. Some people will dismiss evolution by saying it's just a theory, and that's sort of disingenuous. I mean, you can say that for a lot of things. It is an idea of our times anyway, that is situated within our current scientific paradigm, which may change in the future. But it is something that is outside of our ways to verify completely using conventional means. So there are many possible viewpoints that one can have and still have their viewpoints be compatible with the Quran, Hadith is a bit more of a complicated situation, but certainly with respect to the Quran. Okay, so briefly, let's go this way. See, it's so little. Ideas about Darwinism and neo-Darwinism, which is basically more developed ideas of how things evolved and, involving genes and this stuff that we know about now that Darwin didn't know about, started to come into the Muslim world in the 19th century, depending on what part of the Muslim world you're in. Some of this was scientific work, and then you start to get religious responses. So there were some people who were very excited about this because it was a new idea. And we know at this time, in general, responses to the European scientific progress, among the responses was to try to scientize Islam or to try to copy what was going on in Europe. So some people embraced it, and some people have defended it within the 20th century, wholeheartedly, that this is the Islamic view and compatible with the Quran and so forth. Other people did not. They were quite resistant. This is something new. I'm sure that if you ask your great grandmas, if they're still with us, about what things came from Europe in their youths, if they weren't from Europe, maybe a camera or a radio or a television, they'll probably say, we weren't sure about that. Our parents didn't let us watch TV or go to the movies. It was, something off limits. So there was also a resistance to accepting new ideas. So that was the past. And at the same time, I think traditionally, many Muslims, say 18th century, 19th century, even in our time for that matter, had inherited, one can say, I don't mean this disrespectful, but a simple creationist narrative. Allah created Adam and Eve, they went into the garden, they came to earth, and then people got born. No Neanderthals, no complexity, no fossil record, etc. Now, did that come from Islam itself, or maybe it's just Muslims absorbed that because the biblical narrative was present in many Muslim majority regions? It's a good question, but in any case, we had that, and also an association of this with atheism. Then we get to the 20th century, which I know some of you guys weren't even born during the 20th century. Among Christians, especially in the United States where I'm from, there was a lot of opposition to evolution on religious grounds. It's still an issue in America. In some places you can't teach it or you don't teach it. It's not the dominant view anymore. Certainly when I went to school, it was like a thing to study evolution in school, even though I didn't grow up in a particularly religious area. I wasn't heavily Christian. But it was understood that this was something debated. There were people who didn't do it, but we did it. These generations we have, I'm not quite sure as much as if that's an issue. And, certainly to my knowledge, in many Shi'i majority religions, either currently or up until recently, evolution has been taught as fact in science. I'm given to understand it has been formally removed from the curriculum in Iraq. What people do, I don't know, but as a matter of policy, fairly recently. But in general, there's a lot of places where it's taught. So when something is taught in school, like to myself, it becomes normal and ideas become normalized. And of course, in the 20th century, we also do have the strong movement to try to unite Islam and science. So we read the Quran and find the Big Bang Theory in the Quran, right? What ayah is about the Big Bang Theory? It's not that one. Anyway, that's a little sound theory. Anyway, you guys can look that up, but you get books like the Bible, Quran, and science. So there's a lot of push to demonstrate that the Quran is harmonious with modern science, many times with the tacit implication, but the Bible is not, so we're better. Anyway, I'm not saying it's disharmonious, but that was, very dominant, even in the 80s and 90s, as part of dawah that Islam is scientific. And nowadays we're moving to other things. One is there's a bit more of a push to try to find modern and postmodern ideas in classical Islamic texts. So you will find people, for example, who try to find evolution in various, say, 9th century, 10th century, 12th century thinkers. And I think that's sort of it's a mixed bag. I think there's some merit to some of what is said. You can say there's some inherent compatibility, thank you so much, between some classical ideas and evolution. So, for example, there were Muslims in the past, I mean like a long time ago, the past, who did not believe that species need to be fixed, or thought there could be fossils, or thought there were fossils. So this is different from what happened in the Christian narrative, which was basically the species are created and fixed, and then challenging that was a theological issue. So I think it's reasonable to say in the classical text there's scope for ideas that are harmonious with evolution, but of course there's a tendency sometimes to overread things in the past because we want to find what's going on in the classical texts. And I think sometimes that can be a little bit exaggerated, but that's definitely been one thing. And then we've got, of course, new scientific stuff going on, like Europeans tend to be part Neanderthal. That wasn't really around a couple hundred years ago. So, we're coming up with new things that if you're going to accept them at face value, well, you have to integrate them theologically, like what's going on. Did Adam and Eve, I don't know, what happened to make that happen? Because that's not in the simple traditional story that we tend to tell kids or learn about in weekend school or teach in weekend school or whatever. All right, so I'm going to talk about some contemporary, by contemporary, I mean 20th century to our time views that have been presented specifically by 12er Shi'i scholars. Why am I putting it this way? Because Shi'is and Sunnis do use the same Quran, and some of the analytical aspects of the Quran are shared. Like if you want to have a discussion about the words for human being in the Quran, like what is a bashar, what is an insan, what is an Adam? Does an Adam have to be a human being? Could it be a space alien? If you're going to do that, purely on linguistics and grammar and this sort of thing, maybe the surrounding ayat, it doesn't really matter whether you're Sunni or a Shi'i or anything else. You're Buddhist and you're doing your analysis of the Quran because you're all dealing with the same text in a rigorous way. One of the main differences, in my opinion, is the hadith collection. Among the main differences is specifically the 12er Shi'i hadith collection. As some of you guys know, actually, I'm wondering if anyone's probably got it on the tip of their head. They know what I'm going to say. There are some hadith about other Adams. So, one where, as I forget who, one of the imams says, you think you're the only generation of Adams. No, before you, there were Adams. And then there were before other Adams and other Adams before that. So you do have a whole block of hadith about, basically Adamin, other Adams. So, and one of them says that this Adam who was celebrated as our father was descended from the previous Adams. So that immediately makes it a lot easier to accept things like other previous species, Denisovans and Neanderthals and whatever else is there, because you have something in the corpus that's allowing for it. Now, not everyone's going to accept all of these hadith as authentic, but at least they're present in the tradition. Also, another distinguishing thing in the Shi'i corpus is there's an idea of nas, which, in just sort of lore and mythology in sort of the Middle East, it's like, part human, monsters. Sometimes you see the pictures with one leg and hopping around, the scary human-y things. But there is some use also within the Shi'i corpus as other human beings who were alive before Adam, or maybe even, in my opinion, simultaneous. So again, that helps with the discussion of prior humans. So those are a couple of the main differences. There are some others, but I think that's one of the key ones that changes the dialogue slightly. Because if someone is dealing with the hadith corpus, which only allows for Adam to be the first human, you're going to be discussing it a little bit differently. And there's ways that is discussed to sort of get around that and still deal with things as they are scientifically, but we only have half an hour today. So there's a really good book by someone named Shoaib Malik. You guys know him? He wrote a book called, get this, Islam and Evolution. And he tries to use what he thinks would be Al-Ghazali's perspective. I think he might have actually tried too hard, but it's quite comprehensive about Muslim responses to evolution. So I recommend giving it a read if you want to have a look at it. Anyway, these are some common views which have there's a lot of diversity of views. Not everyone is sharing these views, but they occur within the scholarly tradition, like the people at Hausa and so forth. Generally speaking, it's agreed that there's no Islamic theological problem with plants and animals evolving. You also find that, I don't even want to generalize about all Muslims because there's views all over the place. But I think many Muslims in general will agree there's no problem theologically in the Quran with the evolution of plants and animals or extinction. Let me rephrase that. Some people might have theological problems, but there's no Quranic problem with it because the Quran doesn't address that. Yes, the human being was created gradually. This is deduced from very sort of, how do you put it? Getting out your your looking glass or your magnifying glass and scrutinizing ayat. You can make a case that the human being was created gradually. There's also hadith, and this is something you do find in the Sunni corpus and the Shi'i corpus. But by that I mean not the Sahaha Sitta, as far as I know, but some of the more broader books. That either Adam was created over 40 mornings or 40 years. And then when you talk about the before time, you kind of assume, first of all, the numbers tend to be taken as symbolic, like it probably wasn't literally 40. But also, it could just mean spans of time. So this is, their way of saying that the human being or Adam was created over a gradual process, which is how evolution works. It's a gradual thing. Okay, number 3 is actually old and new ideas. There tends to be a dominant view that Adam and Eve were real people, a literal interpretation of the Quran. You will find Muslims who take them archetypally, that they were just, sort of when the Quran talks about Adam, it's talking about human nature and so forth. At least, most traditional Sunnis and 12er Shi'is tend to take a literal interpretation of what's in the Quran. So we're talking about real people, like when the Quran speaks about Adam and his wife as your parents. It's taken to mean they are literally common ancestors that we got descended of, speaking of genealogy, which we were talking about today, for those of us who were here today. There is a view that's starting to circulate that I was alluding to earlier, that Adam may be applied to other sentient, intelligent life forms in the universe, should they exist. Like on Mars or in Andromeda Galaxy or wherever space aliens live, that possibly this is not actually limited to the human being. There's arguments for that. That's a newer thing, that the whole space aliens in Islam is, I guess it's actually not incredibly new, but it's getting more attention. It's getting out of the realm of science fiction. This is something that probably does not match some of our mental pictures. There are a number of Shi'i Mufassirin who argue that Adam and Eve were not the first human beings, like human Homo sapiens, but they lived roughly at the beginning of the agricultural revolution, which is not a long time ago. That's like maybe 10,000 years ago or so. I mean, yes, it's a long time ago, but not compared to the actual existence of the human being. So that is to say, they would be considered recent common ancestors of all living human beings that we have some genetic link to, but that there were other human beings who lived before them and other human species who lived before them. And one of the arguments for that is when Allah says that, Allah istafa Adam, so Allah chose Adam. Typically speaking, when we choose something, we pick it from a group. Like if I go to the kitchen and someone offers me a hazelnut donut and a piece of cake with fruits in it and a biscuit, I choose one of them. Now, of course, that's not the only interpretation. You can say, Allah is not confined by time. Allah can choose Adam, in the spiritual realms or out of time or whatever. But it is something that comes to mind sort of immediately when you read the verse, that when it says, I choose you, I'm picking you from an existing group. So in that sense, Allah is selected among these people to be the forebear of the new chapter of the human species, with special things that happened in the heavens, like Allah teaching Adam the names and something going on spiritually that distinguished him from the other human beings. So it was a sort of break from the past and a new beginning. And that also fits in with the narrations about other Adams. It's easier to handle that if you have that in the corpus. I didn't even put that on the slide. Yeah, some of us today were having a discussion about who Adam and Eve's children married, which is contentious. With that view, and this is a view you do find sometimes nowadays, it's perfectly reasonable to say there were other human beings alive at the time of Adam and Eve, and their children intermarried with other human beings. So they didn't marry their siblings, which is usually a bit uncomfortable for a lot of people. With respect to specifically the Tolver Shi'i Hadith collection, the main views you find are, you do find the sibling marriage that's presented. You find the view that one married a Hori and one married a Jinn. Those are actually the main views. I heard a convincing argument, and I'm not quite sure how far I can get from like normative views here. It's not a non-normative view. It's just not extremely popular. But someone made a convincing argument to me that for some of the narrations, when it talks about jinn at the time of Adam, it's not actually talking about jinns that are like, invisible and stuff. But it's just using it in a literal sense of the other beings, and is actually referring to the other humans that were non-Adamites, who were, sort of a threat and different, and then Allah separated them. So it's not like the invisible jinn were visible and then they got visible, but the other humans disappeared. I think that would fit quite well with the narration about who humans got procreated, well, how their children got procreated from. But in any case, the idea that it was just ordinary interbreeding between, or marrying between Adam and Eve's sheath, basically, and his the other humans, it does solve the problem of the genetic bottleneck, as well as the discomfort of the beginning of human being sibling marriage. So that's another view that does tend to be put forward, and I suspect that will continue to become more popular once we get even more discussions about various types of non-Homo sapiens that we have some genetic link to, which again, it wasn't, that wasn't around in the past when some exegesis was going around. One thing you do not get agreement about, which is probably what you all want to know, what is the view, is how Allah created Adam and Eve. Was it miraculous? Like, were there other human beings and then Allah just said be and it is, and they popped down from the garden, or they sort of rose from the mud? So was it a miraculous creation, or was it just part of the the scientific process, if you will, the process of evolution? It was natural cause, and then something spiritual happened to make the humanoid of Adam into Adam proper, or something else. It's observed that there may be other explanations that we simply don't know at this time. It's not a yes or no sort of thing. It's not that these are the only two options, creationism and evolution, that there could be other things that people will discover later. So you find all views argued for. What you can say is the Quran can be interpreted to support evolution, and it can be interpreted to support, by that I mean human evolution, and it can be interpreted to support creationism. And it doesn't give the details about how people specifically were made, as long as you are understanding this in the light of Allah as the first cause, the ultimate creator, part of the plan of Allah, and that at least something spiritual happened with respect to Adam and teaching Adam the names and so forth. So there is scope for debate there. That's why we've had debates. However, it's also been put forward that if someday we actually prove that evolution as a theory, the theory of human evolution is proven, then we would have to understand the Quran to support that, because we expect the Quran to identify, to be concordant with scientific fact. And we're not at that point, as human beings, where, things like natural selection and mutations are the obvious reasons for why I have eyes, or why we exist, or why I'm here, and why people made this microphone and all of these things. But if this is absolutely proven someday, then it is something we would have to adopt. But currently, it is possible either to remain, if you will, a bit agnostic about it, not taking a firm stance. Some scholars will also say that the purpose of the Quran is not to explain science, and so there's no need to try to look to the Quran for the details of how things happen on a scientific level, which is quite different from a lot of discussions earlier in the 20th century, where there was a lot of push to try to get scientific detail from the Quran. Yeah, but that's also something to consider, that the point of the Quran is not to tell me things about wavelengths and materials and how many elements are there and so forth. The point is primarily divine self-disclosure, so the nature of Allah, truths about this life and the hereafter, other things that are in the unseen, some ethical guidance for life, some rules for life, pertinent aspects of the past. So the Quran itself is not setting itself up as a book to teach us about the things that presumably we can sort out ourselves as human beings. It's more about the things that we really need guidance for. But in any case, one of the views you find specifically among a number of Shi'i scholars, including those who were rather resistant to evolution, such as Allama Tabatabai, did not really consider it to be an agreement with the Quran, even though people do tend to cite him as being somewhat open to it. But by and large, it wasn't his preferred view. But even he said, one's belief in evolution, if you accept it or reject it. He's not the only one. Ayatollah Motahari, for example, said what I'm going to say, that if you believe in evolution or you disbelieve in it, it doesn't threaten theism. So it has nothing to do with, monotheism, the existence of Allah. They're separate things. It's like if I say, I don't know, I'm trying to think of a scientific issue we have today that doesn't have a lot of, ideological baggage or theological baggage. And I can't think of one. Okay, no, I'm still, they all have baggage. Okay, back in the olden days, a lot of people used to think the earth was flat. Nowadays, we think the earth is spherical. Whether you believe the earth is flat or spherical has no basis on your faith in Allah as a creator. It's not an issue pertaining to monotheism or tawheed. It's a scientific issue that you can debate through measurement and fact and reason and, launching cameras to space and taking pictures. The point is, it can be treated completely separately from the spiritual aspect of the human being that connects with Allah. So therefore, in and of itself, believing the earth is flat or not, or the sun revolves around the earth or the earth revolves around the sun, do not necessarily pertain to whether or not Allah exists. So that's a key point. It's a separate issue, and that's, of course, quite different to how the discussion has been discussed in America in particular, among especially the more fundamentalist Christian circles, where it was basically you accept creationism and God, or you're an atheist and you accept evolution. And so they're very closely tied. But there's been a tendency to untie them from each other, regardless of the perspective of the scholar on whether or not evolution is a legitimate theory. So therefore, it doesn't, your view on evolution doesn't make you a Muslim or not a Muslim. You don't stop being a Muslim because you believe or don't believe in evolution. Presumably there's no ramifications for your belief in the afterlife, unless you're like consciously lying and trying to deceive people and so forth. But, if you're doing your best to try to discover truth in life, then it's not related to the fundamentals of faith. So that is also a dominant stance, which I think is nice because it allows scientists to do science and it doesn't require us all to be specialists in everything. So those are very briefly some views about evolution, human evolution, and the evolution of plants and animals in specifically Twelver Shi'i thought and an overall contextualization of it. And I think I do have to stop. So what do we do now? Do we do questions, discussions? Sorry? Okay, so let's do some questions or comments. Yes? Oh, okay.
Hi, you mentioned the Shia hadiths where there were other beings, whether it was the one-legged beings or some of the other beings. What do they say happened to those beings in that hadith?
Okay, may I urge into speculation, or do I have to keep it normative? Okay, I mean, it's not that non-normative. It's just we're getting into the zone of my view and not like Ayatollah Motahari's view or something, as far as I know. Specifically speaking, it's said that Allah destroyed the Nas in particular for being sinful and corrupt. So fasad, for example. In my view, there are a number of problems considering Adam to have been the very first human being from an archaeological and anthropological perspective. And it's not only the agriculture thing. One of the anachronisms we get is Adam is the first farmer. So, he plants, Allah sends him plants. He's very clearly a farmer. And that can be resolved by making him say, well, he started the agricultural revolution, or he was at the beginning. So fair enough. But there's other issues. And I think from an Islamic one, the biggest one is polytheism. As Muslims, we believe, it tends to be a core belief that Adam was a monotheist, and then polytheism emerged through the devolution, the devolving of monotheism, and people went astray. But if you look at the history of religion, there's no evidence of Abrahamic monotheism like 100,000 years ago. You've got animism and, shamanism and, the nature religions. So just from a religious angle, when we talk about, not we, but sort of in the classical Islamic era, these things tend to be blurred sometimes. The wrong act and the wrong theology. So maybe it's a way of saying the Nas had a bad theology, or maybe they were just all fighting each other and doing, whatever they were doing, which was somehow worse than what we're all doing. But yes, in any case, Allah destroyed them upon the advent of Adam.
Thank you, Dr. Inloes, for the presentation. Since we've veered into the territory of your view, out of all the viewpoints or possible viewpoints you've expanded on, if I understood as well Dr. Malik's ideas correctly, he was saying that genetically speaking, human beings today, that we have 8 billion people in the world, don't go back to a common paired ancestors anyway. If that is to be understood as fact, and the Quran, I forget the hadith ones, but the Quran speaking about this Adam, and even the time of when the Christians of Najran came to the Prophet in Medina, and he said, well, what about if you're saying that Isa was born without a father, what about Adam who was born without either of them? How do you, or would you personally reconcile the idea that we don't have common ancestors to the idea that Adam was or the Quranic maybe idea that Adam is our father?
In terms of common ancestry, it has been speculated scientifically within the past few years that all human beings alive today do have a common ancestor who lived within the past few thousand years. I don't recall the exact number, but it is speculated it was fairly recent. One common ancestor, not necessarily two common ancestors. Keeping in mind the population was a lot smaller back in the day, and I've kind of argued with some people about this. So, well, what about the Aboriginal population in Australia? How did they interbreed with someone in Rome? But they pointed out you only need one person to blend with the population to potentially have a long-term impact on the genetics. So I think it fits with the idea of the most recent common ancestor, a recent. I'm not saying Adam was the most recent, but he could have been a recent common ancestor, especially if you keep in mind there have been so many events that have just wiped out the population, plagues and basically plagues. So a lot of it, unfortunately. But human life has been quite precarious. It's only in our time, that we've got such a burgeoning population. So I think that can be supported. I do think a more challenging area is the notion that mitochondrial Eve lived a long time ago. Of course, that there's still all this stuff is a bit nebulous. We do our best. What I think personally, I mean, just to be candid, I'd say in the Muslim tradition, and this tends to be a little bit intensified in the Shi'i tradition, I think that there's a heavy focus on patrilineage. As long as you have the lineage through the father, that's the identity that comes down. And so if you start marrying some women who are non-Adamites, no one really cares. They're still Adam's children because he's the dad. Just from a sort of, Abrahamic patriarchy perspective. So I feel like there's probably some leeway about female lineage and who's who in that regard. That's what I think anyway. I'm open to changing my view should advances in knowledge change.
Thank you very much. I wanted to ask, please, your own analysis, interpretation of what it means that Allah blew His spirit into Adam, what that focal point was in light of your discussion of evolution. Thank you.
It's actually a bit easier to discuss that in the context of evolution than in general. Okay, so veering into the territory of what I think personally, and this is also heavily based on what is present within the 12 Shi'i corpus about the life before this world. Like, I know a lot of people don't accept, that's not true. Some people don't accept Al-Mudar and so forth, but assuming you take all of that, or the idea that the people were made of different clays and all the stuff that happened before, people actually came to Earth, I get a sense that when the Quran and Hadith, Shi'i Hadith, are talking about the creation of Adam and Eve and putting them in a garden, which they then had to go down from, it's relating to the spiritual body, if you will, of the human being, what they would call jism latif, for example, the part that would persist after the barzakh, along with the soul, if you hold to that view that something persists with the soul. And then when they were told to go down, and that there's also, as you may know, exegetical debates about where the garden was. Was it a garden on earth? Was it in the heavens? Is it somewhere similar to the barzakh? And somewhere similar to the barzakh, or in the barzakh even, is the dominant view. And I think that's also the most reasonable view as well. So if you're thinking of that in line, like, you don't have a physical body there. Like, when people pass away, do they take their hand with them and, hey, I'm in the barzakh, look at my hand? You're done with it. You have a different sort of, lighter sort of matter. So I think that was where the formation, if you will, happened, in part because it talks about the formation of people from the clays of Aliyin and Sijin. And again, I guess we could have a debate about bodily resurrection, but in general, when you tell me you get like a handful of clay from Aliyin, I'm not talking about the stuff I dig up from Birmingham in the park or something. It's a different sort of substance. So I think that does relate to inspiring, if you will, the spiritual substance and the spiritual body of Adam and Eve, which was then sent down to earth, which distinguished Adam and Eve from the other human beings. And any number of other changes happened as well. Of course, the other viewpoint is just the spirit that animates life, which I think is a perfectly reasonable discussion, because it is classically held since, I think, ancient times, that most things that move around and talk have some sort of spirit, like animals. They have a sort of animal soul. People have a human soul. Of course, we get to complex things, like if you've got a robot soul and so forth. But, by and large, there's some divine animation or something that happens metaphysically, beyond, just material cause, that sort of adds some spark of life that we can't quite put a finger on. I'm fine with that too, but that's like, I hope that wasn't too convoluted. That's my own thought about how these things work in terms of the chain of coming into being from the heavens on a spiritual level, and not with respect to how the physical body of the human which was formed, which I'll just put out there. I'm fine with the general idea that the physical bodies of people could have evolved from animals. I also don't find it insulting. I think animals are quite respected in the Quran and in the tradition, and we have a lot of stories about animals and stuff in the past. Today, some people consider it insulting. I don't think it's insulting, and frankly, we see a lot of shared behaviors. I'm going to show you a shared behavior on the screen. This is food for thought. Yeah, no joke. He can use it. He can scroll and do all the stuff on it. I don't know if that means we're like them or they're like us, or we just turn our brains off on social media. But the point is, I'm okay with that aspect. I do believe personally that I don't personally think that it's entirely a, how should I put it, that God is not involved in the process and it's just natural selection mutations. I do subscribe to a view of a more involved divine hand in the universe, which many Muslims would classically and today. So I think there's also a metaphysical component that we just can't really talk about because science is secular. But those would have been, the primary natural causes that we're aware of, and there may be other natural causes that we're not aware of, or maybe we will start to bring in metaphysics at a later time. But as a general paradigm, I'm okay with that. You mentioned Shoaib Malik, as did I. He doesn't agree. He's fine with the idea that, from an Islamic perspective and Al-Ghazali's perspective, he's fine with the idea that other human species may have evolved, but Adam himself and Eve were miraculously created and sort of started anew. So there's that there isn't a direct link there, and then they reproduced. So he does he doesn't endorse the full evolution theory.
Thank you so much, Dr. Amina, for accepting our invitation and sharing your knowledge with us. Thank you so much. So our next program will be now next Thursday at 7:30. It's going to be a Quran discussion circle by Dr. Shahid Merali entitled How to Prosper. So a slide with all the verses will be sent on our WhatsApp group so people can, ponder over the verses before the session and have hopefully a fruitful discussion as well. And please note that there won't be any live streaming for that session. As usual, we would kindly appreciate your donations towards Time for Change. You can do so in the donation box that's placed at the entrance or by card or PayPal. You can also sponsor a program for your marhumin at a cost of £10 per name. Today, the refreshments will be served in the entrance hall. And if you can, please kindly note that no food or drinks are allowed in the chapel. And if you can please end by reciting a Surah Fatiha for Marhuma Amina Jan Muhammad and all Marhumin. Al-Fatiha.